In 1971, a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine silently crept into the Soviet Union's Sea of Okhotsk, a place considered utterly impenetrable. No one knew it was there. No sound, no radar, no alarms. Only one mission: to eavesdrop on the Soviet Union's most critical military secrets through their own undersea communication cable. The code name for this operation? Ivy Bells. A mission so classified that most of the crew had no idea what they were actually doing. A mission so successful that the U.S. managed to listen in on the Soviets for nearly a decade, without anyone on the other side ever knowing, until it was betrayed by an American. In every war, there are battlefields the public never sees. During the Cold War, one of those battlefields lay in the deepest, darkest place on Earth, the ocean floor, hundreds of meters below sea level, where sunlight cannot reach, and the pressure can crush steel like tin foil. A silent confrontation unfolded between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was not a war of tanks or missiles, it was a war of information. And it was a war of ghosts. Nuclear submarines stalking each other in silence, waiting for signals, waiting for orders, waiting for the moment of annihilation. Since the early 1960s, the Soviet Navy had rapidly expanded its fleet of strategic nuclear submarines, classes like Yankee, Hotel, and Echo. These vessels could dive hundreds of meters, stay submerged for weeks, and carry warheads with destructive power equal to dozens of Hiroshimas. A Soviet submarine departing from Kamchatka could silently slip through the Bering Sea and approach the U.S. West Coast without detection. In a hypothetical attack, the time between missile launch and American cities being wiped out would be just a few minutes. So the critical question was, how do you know where they are? And more importantly, how do you know when they've been ordered to strike? The answer came from above, from artificial eyes orbiting in space. The CIA's KH-9 hexagon spy satellites captured strange trench lines stretching from shore-based stations on the Kamchatka Peninsula straight into the Sea of Okhotsk. CIA and NSA analysts quickly realized something was off. The Soviets appeared to be burying undersea communication cables, not civilian ones, but special military lines connecting command centers to strategic submarine bases. If the U.S. could tap into those cables, they could access the entire flow of information used by the Soviet Pacific Fleet, from deployment schedules and technical updates to urgent orders from high command. But there was a problem. The cables lay deep beneath the ocean, inside Soviet territorial waters, protected by destroyers, patrol planes, coastal radar, and even magnetic anomaly sensors. Any attempt to breach that zone would be not only dangerous but politically explosive. If discovered, it wouldn't be a minor incident. It would be an international scandal, a potential trigger for war. At Fort Meade, NSA headquarters, a top-secret meeting was held with officials from the NSA, the Navy, the CIA, and technical experts. There, a radical idea was put on the table. Instead of jamming radio waves or cracking encrypted messages, why not place a listening device directly onto the Soviet cable? Technically, the device wouldn't interfere with or alter the signal. It would simply listen. Using electromagnetic sensors, it would record signal pulses passing through the cable and store them on magnetic tape for later retrieval. This was a purely passive form of espionage. No emissions, no interference, no trace left behind. In theory, it was perfect. But in practice, who would dive to a depth of over 120 meters into enemy waters to physically attach such a device to a Soviet cable? The solution came in the form of a strange vessel, a submarine originally designed to launch cruise missiles, later refitted for covert reconnaissance. USS Halibut, 106 meters long, 5,000 tons, as silent as a ghost but equipped with tools no other sub had ever carried. Halibut featured a massive sonar imaging chamber, where technicians could construct maps of the seafloor using acoustic scans. It had a 6-meter robotic arm, controlled remotely to manipulate small objects on the ocean bottom. It carried a pressurized diving chamber, deep-sea cameras capable of filming in total darkness, and, crucially, a precision navigation system allowing the sub to maintain exact position even in strong currents. It was like an underwater space station capable of holding position, filming, cutting cables, or placing a hypersensitive listening device onto enemy lines. Perhaps the most remarkable thing, the entire operation was so classified that most of Halibut's crew had no idea what they were doing. Only a handful of senior officers, select NSA engineers, and a special diving team knew the mission's true purpose. The rest were simply told, "You're heading into the most dangerous waters on Earth. You'll dive deep, work in darkness, and if something goes wrong, no one is coming to save you." Codename Operation Ivy Bells. A name as gentle as a chime, masking what would become the most ambitious undersea espionage mission in U.S. history. As the clock ticked into the early hours of October 1971, USS Halibut departed Apra Harbor, Guam, carrying a mission unlike any in history: to infiltrate deep into Soviet territorial waters, dive to the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, and attach a wiretap to the enemy's military cable. No nation had ever done such a thing. No intelligence operation had ever taken a risk this great. But Halibut would not turn back. To the Soviets, the Sea of Okhotsk wasn't just water. It was a fortress. Surrounded by the Kamchatka Peninsula, Sakhalin Island, and the Russian mainland, the sea was almost completely enclosed, with only a few narrow entry points. This was where the Soviet Pacific Fleet kept most of its nuclear-armed submarines. Moscow regarded the area as internal waters, a strategic backyard, and they defended it at all costs. Coastal radar, torpedo destroyers, anti-intrusion sonar buoys, and IL-38 anti-submarine aircraft patrolled the region daily. For the U.S., merely entering this zone was considered a provocation, but Halibut wouldn't just pass through, it had to stop, hold position, and send men outside to work, right under the enemy's nose. Aboard Halibut, everything shifted into silent running mode. Voices were reduced to whispers. Doors were closed without a sound. Every mechanical part was lubricated and vibration dampened. Sailors were forbidden from striking metal surfaces. Even the clink of a coffee mug on a table could be considered a sound leak risk. In this mode, Halibut became like a massive sea creature, gliding silently through the deep, emitting no signals, giving off no radar, leaving no thermal trail. Navigation officers relied on old sea charts, satellite imagery, and pre-mapped sonar data, tracking every trench, every sandbank, every rock formation that might offer cover. As Halibut entered the Sea of Okhotsk, it faced powerful, unpredictable currents. These deep-water flows could shift direction within hours, destabilizing the submarine. At times, the ship tilted more than 5 degrees in a split second. At such depths, even a 1-knot impact with the ocean floor could crack the hull. Many young sailors took specially formulated anti-nausea drugs, not because of seasickness, but because of the unrelenting psychological tension. They knew that one navigational mistake could crash the vessel into the seabed, or worse, trigger a Soviet radar alert. As they neared the suspected cable site, Halibut slowed to a near drift. The propellers were disengaged. Tiny auxiliary motors adjusted course with near silence. Side-scan sonar came online. Grainy black and white images appeared. Rugged seafloor, dark rocks, patches of mud and sand. Nothing obvious, nothing resembling a cable. Technicians studied the footage, Frame by frame, after hours scanning a 50-meter trench, they spotted a narrow, elongated object with consistent reflectivity, half buried in the silt. No one said a word, but every eye knew that was it. Holding position was the hardest part. Halibut couldn't drop anchor, the noise would be too risky. Instead, they used a micro-thruster system to counter water pressure and hold steady between two opposing currents floating less than 3 meters above the seafloor. Inside, the special diving team performed their final checks. Helium-oxygen pressure suits, headlamps, tethers, cutting tools, and most importantly, the wiretap device, sealed in a steel case weighing nearly 100 kilograms. No one spoke of death, but everyone knew if something went wrong, if they got stuck, if the sub had to flee in an emergency, they'd be left behind. The operation was now entering its most dangerous phase, sending human beings into enemy waters at the bottom of the world. In the heart of the Sea of Okhotsk, more than 120 meters below the surface, USS Halibut hovered like a steel shark, holding its position with micro-adjustments to avoid touching the bottom or drifting in the bone-numbing cold currents. Down there lay the Soviet military telephone cable, one of the most classified communication lines of the Cold War, stretched across the seafloor like the nerve of a sleeping beast. Halibut's mission was to touch that nerve without waking it. At the heart of the mission was a device unofficially known as the TAP. It was a stainless steel structure, specially engineered by NSA technicians in collaboration with Bell Labs. Shaped like a half-cylinder, it clamped onto the cable without cutting into it, a feat of engineering. Instead of direct contact, the device used electromagnetic induction sensors, detecting the analog signals traveling through the cable, amplifying them, and recording them onto large magnetic tapes. The entire system was soundproofed with shock-absorbing polymers and designed to operate for months in extreme pressure and near-freezing temperatures. Inside, it housed hundreds of meters of magnetic tape wound at ultra-low speed, maximizing storage while preserving high signal resolution. An internal clock system timestamped every recorded signal with precision. The lead diver was a young serviceman, already a veteran of many dangerous missions. The second was a civilian technician from the NSA, the man who understood the wiretap's internal workings better than anyone. They wore specially made dive suits, thick outer rubber and inner helium-oxygen insulation layers to withstand 12 atmospheres of pressure, 12 times what we experience at sea level. Each carried a headlamp, a cutting tool, a short-range wireless transceiver linked to the control room, and a sonar reflector beacon, allowing Halibut's crew to track every movement. The pressure chamber door opened. They slipped into the ink-black water. No light, no visible bottom, just the slow hiss of their breathing gear and the faint murmur of cold water brushing against their suits. At that depth, time was the enemy. Though helium-oxygen was safer than nitrogen at such pressure, it had limits. Each diver had just 20 to 25 minutes to work outside the sub. Any longer and the risk of gas toxicity, unconsciousness, or death would increase exponentially. The current was stronger than expected. Maintaining body control to operate precisely on a narrow cable in total darkness required the steadiness of performing heart surgery during an earthquake. They found the cable, partially buried in silt, anchored by small natural rock formations. Installing the device meant lifting the cable just a few centimeters, enough to slip the tap beneath, but not enough to snap a connection. The lead diver gently pried the cable upward. The technician slid the device into place and locked it down with the triple latch mechanism. A tiny click echoed through their headsets, but in Halibut's control room, it rang like a bell of triumph. They powered up the system. It began recording. Electromagnetic signals came through, crisp and clear. No noise, no detection. The internal software logged the first time code. Okhotsk 01, 0321 UTC. The two men cleaned up, gently swept silt back over the cable, and drifted away from the site. They returned to the sub in total silence. As their bodies were pulled into the decompression chamber, someone gave a silent pat on the shoulder, but no one spoke. The entire crew stood frozen in a tension beyond words, the kind of silence that only follows survival from the edge of death. The very first American wiretap installed during Operation Ivy Bells was now active. It emitted no signal. It caused no disruption. It simply recorded every message exchanged between Soviet fleet commanders and submarine bases across the Far East. It lay there, like a blind eye that never closed, an ear that never slept. No one on the Soviet side knew that from that moment on, every call from Petropavlovsk, every combat readiness alert, every technical malfunction report was being captured and quietly stored, awaiting playback in an NSA listening room thousands of miles away. When USS Halibut safely departed the Sea of Okhotsk, Operation Ivy Bells was only halfway done. The wiretap had been installed successfully, but the bigger question remained. What exactly had it recorded, and what kind of secrets were now waiting inside those reels of magnetic tape? 3 weeks after the installation, USS Halibut returned to the exact spot, deep in enemy waters, to retrieve the device and swap out the recording tape. It was every bit as dangerous as the initial mission. The sub had to hold steady in silence. Divers had to work quickly, avoiding stirring up sediment or shifting the device too much, anything that might draw attention. The first reel, nearly 300 meters long, housed inside a 20-kilogram pressure-resistant canister, was pulled aboard and locked away like a nuclear code vault. No one was allowed to touch it except the NSA technician on board. Under the dim red lights of a soundproof chamber, he began checking for signal quality. Just one phrase, signal detected, would mean the operation had become a historic success. Inside a dark room at NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, a small team of cryptographers and signal analysts gathered around the playback system. The real word, and then a voice. Male, fluent, crisp Russian, military cadence. Post 4, report sonar system status on the southern quadrant. Confirm unidentified signal, 12:47 Moscow time. No one in the room spoke, but they all knew it had worked. The device hadn't just captured signals, it had recorded actual voice communications between Soviet naval units. And more importantly, it was crystal clear. No interference, no encryption, no disguises. Within 72 hours, the NSA had extracted over 400 internal calls between Fleet Command at Petropavlovsk and submarine bases in Magadan, Vladivostok, and Sakhalin. Some messages discussed fuel pump failures, missile maintenance schedules, and departure times of Yankee and Delta-class submarines, information the U.S. had previously guessed at from satellite photos or by tracking vessel disappearances. One 6-minute call between two senior officers detailed the exact missile launch procedures in a nuclear alert, chain of command, response timings, action codes, every word captured. This wasn't tactical intelligence anymore. This was a direct punch into the spine of the Soviet military command system. The volume of data coming from the tap grew so large that the NSA created a dedicated unit, codename Fishbowl, solely to process Ivy Bell's recordings. Each reel was digitized, transcribed, and sorted by content, location, and command level. Russian linguists worked in rotating shift to translate, summarize, and encrypt reports for the National Security Council. Some tapes were marked eyes only, seen by only 3 people at the White House. Among them, evidence of radioactive leakage aboard a Delta-class sub, internal disputes over long-range patrol doctrine, and even veiled criticisms of the Soviet defense minister's policies. For the first time, America had a window into the Soviet war machine, unfiltered, unguessed, and unhacked. Just one briefcase-sized device sitting quietly on the ocean floor. Yet with each return to Okhotsk to retrieve tapes, danger hovered like a blade. NSA, in coordination with the Navy, developed an emergency protocol. If the device was ever discovered, the crew would trigger an electric pulse to melt the magnetic tape and burn all internal circuits. Every recovery mission brought a backup device. Tape swaps were performed like flight recorder changes, fast, precise, and flawless. No U.S. submarine ever approached the same coordinates twice. Access routes were constantly shifted. Data was compartmentalized. So, if any crew member were captured, no one could betray the whole operation. Over the next 7 years, the TAP was upgraded repeatedly. NSA added voice print analyzers to identify specific speakers, and even integrated onboard encryption in case the device was compromised. The deep-sea game had evolved, from eavesdropping to full neural intrusion of a military command structure. And it all began with one dive into the deep in the middle of the night. For nearly a decade, Operation Ivy Bells remained hidden in the shadows, steady, effective, and completely undetected. It was the crown jewel of American intelligence, a miracle of engineering lying in the depths, where every whisper from the enemy was captured like a voice in the dark. But like every great secret, what brought it down didn't come from the outside. It came from within. Ronald William Pelton was a former signals analyst at the NSA. Fluent in Russian, he had access to highly classified information, including reports connected to Operation Ivy Bells. But in 1979, Pelton's life began to unravel. He filed for bankruptcy, lost his job, and was left with no income, no prospects, and a festering bitterness. One evening in January 1980, Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. No disguise, no hesitation. He spoke a single sentence in Russian. "I used to work for the NSA. I have information to sell." Armed with only his memory, no documents, no evidence, Pelton began to recount everything he knew to the KGB. Among those secrets was Ivy Bells. Pelton explained to the KGB how the U.S. had planted a wiretap on the seafloor in Okhotsk. He described the device's structure, the recovery schedule, the frequency of tape swaps, even the emergency self-destruct mechanism. Initially skeptical, the KGB gradually realized Pelton knew too much. He didn't just provide technical details. He explained how the NSA processed the recordings, how conversations were translated, and how intelligence was passed directly to the U.S. president. And the price of this betrayal? Just $35,000 in cash, and a few hotel reimbursements. After receiving Pelton's intel, the KGB didn't act immediately. They didn't remove the device. They didn't denounce the U.S. Instead, they let the tap stay, recording. But now, it was listening to staged conversations. Soviet officers were ordered to conduct scripted phone calls packed with false information, carefully crafted to mislead NSA analysts. Other conversations hinted at suspicions of being tapped, but never explicitly, enough to plant doubt, never enough to confirm. NSA no longer knew if they were hearing truth or fiction. It became a psychological battlefield, and the Soviets were in control. The first real break came in 1985 when Soviet KGB officer Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the U.S. During interrogation, he mentioned an American with red hair who had sold secrets to the KGB. That vague clue was the first puzzle piece. The FBI began combing through former NSA employees with financial issues, Russian language backgrounds, and red hair. Ronald Pelton, bankrupt former Russian linguist, red-haired, quickly rose to the top of the suspect list. In November 1985, the FBI approached him through a staged phone call. Pelton took the bait. After 10 hours of questioning, no coercion, no threats, he confessed everything. The meetings with the KGB, the information he revealed, and crucially, the betrayal involving the undersea wiretap. In 1986, Ronald Pelton was convicted of 3 counts of espionage and 1 count of conspiracy. The sentence? Life imprisonment. Although he was paroled after serving over 30 years, since his leaks didn't cause direct casualties. The U.S. intelligence community never publicly disclosed what was lost because of Pelton, but according to multiple unofficial sources, once the KGB verified his claims, they recovered the Ivy Bells wiretap and transported it to Moscow for study. Operation Ivy Bells, the pinnacle of American undersea espionage, didn't end because of detection offshore. It ended because someone sold it in the heart of Washington. The Ronald Pelton affair became a cautionary tale in every U.S. intelligence training program. No system is secure if the people inside are compromised. The battle beneath the ocean, with all its brilliance, courage, and innovation, was undone by one man's loneliness, desperation, and greed. And even though Ivy Bells was gone, its legacy lived on. It proved that in the Cold War, the deep sea was not a refuge. It was a battlefield where even a whisper could change history. Operation Ivy Bells ended in silence. No funeral, no press release from the White House, no medals handed out, just files stamped top secret, locked away in the dark vaults of the NSA. And yet, what Ivy Bells left behind didn't stay in archives. It became part of the history of modern intelligence, where the ocean depths were no longer safe havens, but battlegrounds cloaked in shadows. Ivy Bells was the first operation in history where signals intelligence wasn't collected by satellites or ground stations, but from the deep sea, in places no one imagined could be tapped. It proved that undersea cables, long thought to be passive, untouchable infrastructure, were actually the arteries of every modern military command. And if someone could tap into those arteries, they could read everything from the heartbeat to the brain. Instead of storming the fortress, the U.S. threaded a wire into the enemy's nervous system, listening to every order, every outburst, every fear. From Ivy Bells, the U.S. expanded multiple programs, tapping cables in the White Sea, the Sea of Japan, and even near the Arctic. Devices became smaller, more stealthy, and smarter, incorporating early AI for signal analysis, years ahead of their time. The NSA, once a passive analyzer, became the architect, coordinator, and operator of deep-sea intelligence campaigns, leaving the Soviet Union at least a generation behind. The USS Halibut, the submarine that carried out Ivy Bells, was decommissioned in 1976, but its legacy lived on through even more specialized vessels. The USS Parche, USS Seawolf, USS Jimmy Carter, all were designed with one mission in mind: undersea espionage, tapping cables, cutting communications, intercepting signals, even directly manipulating enemy systems. They were the ghosts of the deep, no names on radar, no whole numbers on maps, but carrying the secrets of the world. Equipped with pressure-proof diver chambers, remotely operated vehicles, and onboard analysis labs, they used tools that once belonged in science fiction, now deployed beneath the oceans since the 1980s. And it all started with Halibut and Ivy Bells. Today, over 95% of the world's data still travels through undersea cables, including military communications, financial transactions, and even secure calls between heads of state. Every mouse click, every line of code, every missile launch command must pass through strands of glass thinner than a human hair. And Ivy Bells forced the world to wake up. Cables were no longer just infrastructure to defend passively. They were strategic battlefields to dominate proactively. Since then, nations, not just the U.S., began building both offensive and defensive capabilities for undersea cable warfare, installing intrusion detection sensors, physically encrypting data lines, and deploying surveillance submarines to patrol high-value routes. The underwater war, silent but fierce, officially began the moment Ivy Bells succeeded. Ivy Bells also left behind a painful lesson. Even the most advanced technical operation can be undone by its greatest weakness, the human factor. No device can eavesdrop on betrayal. No encryption can stop a desperate man from walking into a foreign embassy to sell an entire strategic legacy for a few $1,000s. Machines may block sound from leaking outward, but who can block a whisper from within? From Ronald Pelton, the intelligence community learned a hard truth. Every technological risk can be calculated, but no algorithm can fully contain human weakness. In the end, those who made Ivy Bells happen, submarine officers, NSA engineers, Special Forces divers, remain nameless. No textbooks, no headlines, no public medals. But thanks to them, the US knew in advance when Soviet submarines were being deployed. Thanks to them, Washington could act before a crisis escalated. And thanks to them, part of the world was spared from ignition because they prevented a misunderstanding between two nuclear powers. They didn't write history, but they kept it from going off course. They dove into the depths so we could continue to live on the surface. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with others. See you in the next mission.